Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Vicki Goodman, and on behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors, I'm excited to welcome you to today's Open Mind program on empathy. For those of you who are with us for the first time, the Open Mind brings together thought leaders in science and culture, like today's featured presenters, Dr. Sherry Turkle, Professor of the Social Studies of Science and Technology at MIT, and Dr. Marco Iacoboni, Professor of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCLA. We are honored to have both of these distinguished scholars here with us today to share their knowledge and expertise with us. Dr. Sherry Turkle is the author of the critically acclaimed new memoir, The Empathy Diaries. She is a preeminent media scholar, the founding director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self, and the author of 6 books, including 2 New York Times bestsellers, Reclaiming Conversation and Alone Together. She's also the recipient of the Ms. Magazine Woman of the Year and Guggenheim and Rockefeller Humanities Fellowships. Dr. Marco Iacoboni is the author of the new celebrated book, Mirroring People, The Science of Empathy and How We Connect with Others. He is the director of the Neuromodulation Lab at the Amundsen Lovelace Brain Mapping Center at UCLA. He studied medicine, neurology, and neuroscience in Rome, Italy, and joined the faculty of the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA in 1999. Dr. Iacoboni investigates brain systems and mechanisms for higher cognitive functions, in particular social cognition in health and disease, and his vast research has been cited more than 42,000 times. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping guidelines. Our program today will run for 1 hour. And following the discussion, we have reserved time for your questions, which we ask that you please type into the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible during the time allotted. Today's program is being taped and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel, which you can find on our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org. There you will also find a library of videos from past Open Mind programs, a calendar of upcoming events, information about our Friends Scholar Program, our WOW Joint Friends Resnick Yearly Event, and our Open Mind Film Festival for high school students that will be held on April 28th, 2022. There you will also find a donation page. If you are able, we hope that you will support our work so that we can continue to bring our Open Mind programs about mental health issues as a free public service. So what happens when you pair a preeminent media scholar with a preeminent neuroscientist, both who study empathy from their unique areas of research and expertise? We are now all about to have the privilege of finding out. So please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Marco Iacoboni, who will speak first and then invite Dr. Turkle to join him. Thank you so much.
Good evening, and thank you for the kind introduction. I want to start this by telling you how I got into the research that we've been doing for many years now, more than 20 indeed, here at UCLA. It was a bit serendipity. I was interested in how the brain puts together perception and action, how we see things and then react on things. And then I ran into an Italian that was studying the monkey brain, and his name is Giacomo Rizzotti. We were both in Prague at a meeting, and he was telling me about these cells that they discovered in the monkey brain. These cells are in the part of the monkey brain that controls the grasping action of the monkey. And they found that some of these cells were firing not only when the monkey was making the action, but also when the monkey was actually seeing the actions of other people without moving at all, the monkey. And they thought this was quite a surprising discovery. Initially, they were almost incredulous because there was something that was basically define most of our beliefs on how the brain works, especially the parts of the brain that control our movements, our actions. And they thought, well, why do we have these things in the brain? And they wanted to investigate this more. I was already in LA, and I told him, this sounds very interesting and right up my alley, because I want to figure out how the brain puts together perception and action. And so we started collaborating. We had just opened the Brain Mapping Center. One of the very first studies that we did was using brain imaging and looking at how the brain of human beings computes things that are important for imitation. Why imitation? Well, mostly because I thought, well, these cells, the cells that Rizzotti is telling me about, these mirror neurons, seem to be really important for imitation. After all, they get busy when we make an action, when we see someone else making the same action. But also because imitation is really an important component of human behavior. We learn a lot by looking at other people, not only in terms of skills, but also in terms of how to behave. Especially when we are in a new environment, what we do is that we look at other people, what they do, how they behave, and we sort of conform. We adapt to those kinds of social conventions. So we did an early study. It was very successful. The idea was to figure out how to model brain activity using imaging, not the recordings that the people that were studying the monkey brain were using, and figure out which regions of the brain were important for imitation. That study was so successful that it was discussed all over the world. And it was also noted by this British psychologist, Celia Heiss, and she's been studying imitation for a long time. And she sent me this paper by these two social psychologists from New York. And in this paper, what they show is that what humans tend to do when they interact, when they are face-to-face, and Sherry has talked a lot about face-to-face interaction in her beautiful book, The Empathy Diaries. When we are face-to-face, what we tend to do, we tend to sort of imitate each other. We don't do it, we're not even aware of it, but we tend to do it. So say that I lean forward and you are in front of me in my office, what you tend to do is to do something similar to that, so that you also lean forward toward me. But there are differences. Some people do it more, some people do it less. So the study that Celia Heiss sent me, well, the study was showing that indeed, the more you tend to do that, the more you tend to imitate automatically without even noticing, with no intention to do it, just do it. The more you tend to do that, the more you tend to be empathic. And I thought this was really interesting because on one end, it's almost surprising why imitation and empathy should be so linked in human behavior. But then I also realized that a lot of thinkers all over many centuries were describing human behavior that was doing something like that. Descartes, Montaigne, Hume. I used to give talks in which I was quoting all these thinkers. And I thought, well, I'm a brain scientist. I study the brain. I use brain imaging and brain stimulation to figure out how brain systems in our brain are actually implementing our behavior. So what does it mean that when we interact socially with others, we tend to imitate them and they tend to imitate us? And the more we do that, the more we tend to be empathic. In terms of brain activity, that means that my systems in the brain that are important for imitation, my mirror neuron systems, must be also talking to the emotional brain centers, those areas that are important for processing the emotions of others, but also for feeling the emotions that we feel. So we did a series of studies. We actually indeed showed that imitation and empathy and the systems for the mirror neuron areas for imitation and the emotional brain centers for feeling the emotions and seeing the emotions of others are talking to each other. Indeed, so the idea would be that if I see you smiling, basically the cells that I use in my brain when I smile are also active. And by doing that, I send through these mirror neuron areas, I send these signals to my emotional brain centers, and I feel what you're feeling. I don't have to really conjecture what you're doing. I feel it automatically. So that was basically the beginning of a series of studies that we also apply to a bunch of other domains, including speech. You're listening to me, right now. And you may be surprised with what I'm going to tell you now, but your speech motor centers in your brain are also active. It is as if you're sort of imitating what I'm saying. And that activity in the brain, it's important for you to actually understand what I'm saying. So our brain's almost been built as a sort of an imitation machine. It's also as an empathy machine, because we tend to sort of mimic what other people do. So this led us to do studies in which we thought, okay, that's what we see in the brain. It's important for human behavior. And so we did studies in which we were seeing how the brain activates when our participants are seeing emotional faces, someone angry, someone happy. And then we look at how the activity in the brain corresponds or predicts human behavior, such that the more active these regions are, when you actually see someone in pain, you should be more empathic. And indeed, we were seeing something like that. We were seeing that indeed we were more empathic. Our participants that were activating these regions more were feeling more the feelings of and the emotions of other people, showing that indeed the activity in the brain that we were seeing was really relevant to human behavior. And that was one of the reasons why I actually decided I had to write this book, because the story that was coming out of the lab was such a beautiful story. For many years, we've been taught, for centuries, we've been taught that human beings are selfish beings, that we are basically mostly caring for our own self-preservation. And the story that was coming out from my lab and other labs was actually telling us that we have built in the brain something that makes us wired for empathy. And I thought that was such a beautiful story that I felt I wanted to sort of describe this story in a book that was available and accessible, not just to specialists, but also to general readers. And that's why I wrote that book, Mirroring People. But the other reason I'm thinking about it is because, you know, you do many, many years of research, and you also want to celebrate your own trainees. And I have to say that if you read the book, indeed, there is also a celebration of many trainees that were in the lab and did the studies with me, and the progress in our understanding of how mirror neurons are so important for empathic behavior in humans. The final thing I want to say before I want to actually start the conversation with Sherry is that her book is really a book that talks a lot about both the emotional component of empathy, but also the cognitive component of empathy. And when we started looking into mirror neurons, we thought, well, mirror neurons seem to be really, really important for what we call affective empathy, the emotional empathy. But then we were also thinking, well, but we see also this sort of correlation between the brain response in our lab and how people behave in real life. So there must be also some link to cognitive empathy, because humans do not just mimic others in terms of their feelings and emotion. They also have empathic behavior that is cognitive in a way. And so we started doing a series of studies. And these are the last study we published last year. I want to tell you about it because really it's a beautiful demonstration of how you do 20 years of research and you get to a point in which you can do something that is almost radically strong in showing the connection between the emotional aspect of empathy in the brain and the cognitive aspect of empathy in the brain. We know that there are sets of areas that are important for emotional affective empathy and some others that are important for more cognitive empathy. Seeing things from your point of view, taking your own perspective. It doesn't have to be emotional, it can be just very cognitive. Well, we have mapped a bunch of these areas, so we can actually look at the activity in these areas. And we thought, well, if these two systems in the brain, the emotional and the cognitive, are talking to each other all the time, then we should be able to actually see that even when the brain is at rest, it's doing nothing. So we did a study in which we put our participants in the scanner and we measured the brain activity where they're just doing nothing, they're just resting in the scanner. And then we measured the wiring, the connections between these aspects of the brain that are important for your more affective empathy, the mirror neuron areas, and the ones that are important more for cognitive empathy. And then what we do is to do machine learning. We basically teach an algorithm to look at the wiring and tell the algorithm, well, this is the wiring of this participant, and this is the level of empathy of this individual. And the machine, the algorithm, the classifier, the way we call it, learns these associations. And then we tell the classifier, well, this is the wiring of this particular brain. Can you guess how empathic is this individual? And the answer is yes. Our classifier, our algorithm can figure out, just by looking at the wiring between the areas of affective and cognitive empathy, how empathic individuals are, which really tells us how strong are the connection between what we call affective emotional empathy and what we call more cognitive empathy. And I think that's a beautiful way to also celebrate Sherry's book, because a lot of the aspects of the book that she talks about percolate between the cognitive and the emotional. And I want to really start a conversation with her on this, and I will be also asking her a bunch of questions, quoting passages of the book and asking her what she was thinking, what she wanted to say with those quotes. And I'll call Sherry in. Please, Sherry, join us.
Hi.
Hi, Sherry.
Hello.
How are
What
you?
a beautiful introduction.
Thank you. Good to see you. Okay, let me start with this. A lot of people ask me, why did you write your book? And I want to ask you the same thing. And I said why. I mean, right, because I wanted to basically tell the story that we were finding the human brain is actually wired for empathy. But what about you? Why did you write the Empathy Diaries?
I thought it was very important to tell a story of the passion behind one's work. Because my work, obviously in your work too, it's not my job. It's my, there's really a passion in my lifelong conversation with technology and with engineering culture, where I really have interrogated it about, in some ways, its lack of empathy. It's not trying to open up technology to issues of ethics and empathy, and I knew deeply that this was not just a job, and I wanted to see if I could write a book that really was an intellectual biography, but that really told my personal story and integrated the thought and feeling that I had brought to my work. And it was really a journey. I learned many things that I hadn't expected, but that was my motivation.
That resonates with me a lot. I mean, reading your book, I thought it's the first time I read a memoir. And I think, well, why do I love this book so much? Because it's a memoir, and you're such a diehard academic. I love all the stories about what you were thinking. What should I do? Should I study this aspect of technology or that one? How you actually decided through college and then graduate studies and then your junior year as a faculty to go through the academic industry. And you're right. I mean, what we do is not just a job. It's passion. Yes. We love it.
Yes. But, the question of why empathy turned out to really go back to my childhood, where I was told my mother had been married when I was very to my biological father and divorced him, but she lived in a culture where she wanted to hide that. And so I was told to never use his name. And when she remarried to Mr. Turkle, even though my name was not Sherry Turkle yet, he didn't adopt me until many, many years later, I had to lie and say that my name was Sherry Turkle. We never discussed my father. He was erased. And I had to hide my school books that had a trace of my real name in order to sustain my mother's lie. And these people loved me so. There was a combination of love and a lie. And so I set myself the task of sort of trying to understand what could they be thinking, to put me through this. And it felt to me, I mean, I wasn't shown empathy, but I became kind of the Nancy Drew detective of my own life to try to figure out empathically what these people, what was on their mind. So the question of other people's minds and reading other people's minds and getting into other people's skin was really my defense, my salvation, my way to stay sane, my strategy for survival, before it was an academic subject. So it goes very deep for me, and I wanted to tell that story.
Well, I got to say, it's really amazing because you actually anticipated, maybe there is such a strong connection. That was exactly the first question I wanted to ask you about all this issue that you had to hide this German last name. It's so interesting. You actually anticipated my question. But the other part of the question was that, do you think that that childhood experience, the fact that you had a name that you had to hide, in a way also inspired you to look? One thing you do is also looking into the aspect of self. And generally, people who are interested in technology don't really care much about self. I think it's a very interesting combination. It's actually a sort of very interdisciplinary. Do you think that your life experience early in life, in a way, directed you to really be interested in the aspect of self, asking who you are, how you see yourself, how you can change yourself over the years, and so on?
Very much. I mean, the question of identity, of who I was. One thing for sure is that it made me convinced that there was such a thing as the unconscious, because the first topic that I took was the study of a French psychoanalyst named Jacques Lacan, whose theory centered around le nom du père, the name of the father, as the central constitutive element in a person's identity. And I just went off saying I really wanted to study this figure, and I wanted to study why France hadn't accepted psychoanalysis. I had I wrote a book. It was my thesis, and I never put together, until I was in Paris at a lecture and just began to cry. I had never put together that I was studying the name of the father, a girl who had been denied her father's name.
Right.
And there were so many things in my life where the unconscious writing was kind of written on the wall, the question of what we know and what we don't know, and what we sort of know but can't say, that I also wanted to capture that the reasons to believe in something like an unconscious, are not just because you find it in a textbook, but can come from, the interrogation of your experience.
Right. Okay, let me ask you one thing about your relationship with your mother. There are a number of quotes that I would like to actually read, but for the interest of time, I want to read one. There's an issue about your mother wanted to hide something about her illness to you.
Yes.
And then you found out and you asked yourself, but shouldn't I actually have known? And so you say at some point, the more I've analyzed what I should have known, given the data before me, the more I believe that what I knew most of all was that I was not supposed to know about my mother's body. I understood it was taboo. In this sense, our empathic connection worked. Can you unpack that? It's a beautiful quote.
Yes. Well, my mother had breast cancer when her first illness was when I was 9 years old. And I actually remember my grandparents waiting at our house for news about the surgery, all dressed up as though being dressed up in a kind of armor would protect them against this news, against what the bad news could be. And so her cancer began when I was 9, and she died when I was 19. So for 10 years, she struggled with this. And she knew that if I knew about it, I would not go away to college. I just would not fly away the way I really wanted to. From very, very early, I wanted to leave Brooklyn. I wanted to go to Radcliffe. I knew about Harvard and Radcliffe. John F. Kennedy went to Radcliffe. I went to Harvard. I was going to go to Harvard. I just had this drive to leave the very sheltered world in which I had grown up. And she determined that she was going to keep this a secret from me. And it's one of those things where when I found out, I say in the book, what I thought you were going to read is the little part where when the doctor tells me, thinking I know, well, you know, your mother has maybe 2 weeks. And I realized that he's telling me she's going to die in 2 weeks, not that she's going to come home from the hospital in 2 weeks. I realized that I didn't know, but I knew. I already knew this. And so the unpacking of that part of the book is really part of an interrogation that comes up over and over about the things we know, but have not allowed ourselves to see and say. And I think that's part of the study of empathy. You know, the things we know about other people, but can't voice, don't want to admit to ourselves. At one point in the book, I tell the story of a marriage that I enter into while I'm in psychoanalysis. And I start before I'm getting married, I start to lie to my analyst about what's going on in the relationship. Because I know that, you know, this marriage is really not kosher. It's not going to stand the scrutiny of a psychoanalysis. So I start to kind of begin a process of lying to myself about what's going on. Of course, later I revisit all of these things for myself. But the book is very much about that question of self, the unconscious, what we know, what we can face at different times in our life. Yes.
Yeah, that's actually, it's a great aspect of the book, because it really tells us that you can actually study things that seem so dry, like technology, because at the end of the day, you also talk, the last part of the book is about your work at MIT and technology. And actually, a lot of these things, there is a lot of emotions and feelings into that. There's a beautiful quote in which you actually say that basically people that are coding, when they code, computer code, they're almost putting some of themselves into the coding such that they see the computer as a second self.
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
Well, actually, I was interviewing children as they learned to program. And I was expecting it to be, I had all the preconceptions of a humanist, expecting this to be kind of dry. And the children started to talk about their fantasies as they projected themselves in a way into the mirror of the machine. Because after all, the computer, I call it an evocative object because it sort of stands on the border between what's alive and what we see is not alive, what it thinks, but it doesn't think. And these children would program something, and then they would say something like, you put a piece of your mind into the computer's mind, and you come to see yourself differently. And this was from a 13-year-old girl who, even at 13, had trouble. She was beginning to use alcohol, she was smoking, she was overweight. She had a sense of not being in control of herself and her body. And she created a world on the computer where she felt in complete control, where every time she made the cursor turn to draw with the computer, for example, she only made it turn 30 degrees. She called it her 30 degrees world. And she found a way to use the computer to think about questions of control and to begin to ask herself, well, could I create those kinds of rules for myself in the areas of my life where I need rules? And I began to see that the computer was not a dry, kind of just a machine, but it really was, as I said, this evocative object that was going to enter into the culture, in a very powerful way. And anyone who who has grown up now with this technology, with digital technology, knows the tremendous amount of projection and, you know, living on the screen and avatars we create on the computer, and the sense that the computer is an extension of self, that my insight really was correct. It's not just what the computer does, it's what the computer does to us.
And that's actually, I want to say one thing, because it's a really funny thing that just happened 1 hour ago, but then I want to go back to that issue because it's an important issue that really, and you're making the argument, really the computers can get in the way of human interactions. And we have to probably not to create more technology, but actually try to really start looking again at each other's face and being face to face. But the final thing I want to say is that before this thing, we had an event in brain mapping, and one of the postdoc we were talking about computer coding, and he was saying, well, when you look at the coding that someone else has written, it's so difficult to fix it. You don't understand it. It's almost as if someone else's writing is completely different from your own writing. It should be just coding, but actually even the coding seems to have a personal
Yes,
aspect of it.
very much.
If you're trying to fix the coding of someone else, you just don't even get it much.
Right. Well, you know, I did a study that's very interesting. I mean, that's with coding, so it was even more intense. But I did a study of how people from, you know, kind of 10 feet away can recognize their computer screen, their computer desktop, by the way they've organized, you know, their desktop. That the desktop is an intent. You know, we all have the same. You know, we all have the same little desk, you know, little file folders, but it's such an intensely personal thing. Right. And if I said to you, look, yours is a little messy, I'm a kind of neat Nick, let me just organize your computer desktop. You would go, absolutely not, you know, because it really is a kind of extension of your thinking space. And it's in that sense, the coding is very much an extension of people's thinking space. And actually one of, yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, one of the papers, one of the things I discuss in the book is the notion of pluralism in styles of coding. And the whole idea that people need to use different styles with the computer. And that the early way of looking at the computer, that it was just one thing and it was kind of cut and dried, really needed to mature to see it as an object that really was a kind of Rorschach almost of people's intellectual styles.
Yeah, you actually talk about theoretical pluralism, psychological pluralism, therapeutic pluralism, all things that I actually love that you mentioned in the book. But I want to go back to the issue of, you know, there's such a strong sense of projection when we deal with these screens. With these different screens, we have iPhones, we have laptops, we have desktops. So you really describe this sense of relationship with these machines. But I think that what's really lacking, and that's why actually I like your idea, you have to reclaim conversation, and alone together is probably not the right way to actually go, is the fact that when you have a face-to-face interaction, even the pretty funky face-to-face interaction that we have now through Zoom, which is not exactly the same thing as we were actually in the same room. It's very different. There's the back and forth of conversation, which is something you don't get with technology, with screens. No. You get some of it. Gamers may get some of it. Very complex game, but it's not the same thing. Why do you think it's so important? I totally believe it is. You really have to actually nurture those face-to-face interactions and conversations and human connection. But tell me why you think it's so important that we don't get the computers and technology doesn't get in the way of human empathy.
Well, I mean, I really think that there's an assault on empathy that's happening because of our dedication to screens now. And actually it begins with not just with face-to-face interaction, but with our difficulty with solitude. Because after all, it's only if you can be alone and kind of be able to have the capacity for quiet and solitude and know who you are, that you can then turn to another person and say, who are you? Let's be there for a mutual relationship. And what the onslaught of always there being input from a screen. I mean, we put slots for iPads in baby bouncers, in potty trainers for children. What that does is rob people of the need to develop the capacity for solitude. And I really think that once you've undermined the capacity for solitude, you've then undermined the capacity for relationship. In the psychoanalytic tradition, the psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott has a wonderful phrase. I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, if you don't teach your children to be alone, they'll only know how to be lonely.
You just read my mind because I wanted to quote you exactly on that. It's a beautiful quote.
Yes. And basically, we've jumped into this computer universe without without asking the question, well, what is it going to do to our capacity for solitude? And then once you are, and then that was the first point about solitude and the relation to mutuality. And then the second thing, which is I think is a more discussed point, is that if you're always looking down at your phone and you're not, or your device, or you're always looking to, give me my phone, I need to know what's happening on my phone, you really are not available for the relatively long time and patience it takes to really develop a conversational relationship with someone else. I mean, this conversation is a pleasure, even though it's on Zoom, because we've really been given a space to talk, to laugh, to share a thing. You have a favorite quote about my mother. I mean, it's the beginning of a friendship. It's the beginning of a real conversation.
Yeah.
And there's in my research, there's a group of students, college students, who explained to me the rule of three. The rule of three is, if you're sitting with a bunch of friends at dinner, 3 people need to have their head up in conversation before you'll put your head down to look at your phone. So the whole thing is a kind of round robin of heads up and down. So it preserves kind of the illusion of a dinner table conversation. And I'm thinking about this and explaining to me the rule of 3, and I'm thinking, what kind of content, what kind of conversation are they having while their heads are bobbing up and down? That nothing that's vulnerable, nothing. I mean, I wouldn't discuss my book, my mother's death, my mourning, all the things that were, I was thinking about sort of last year, if I was in a conversation, when I was thinking about all these things, I was writing my book, I couldn't be in a conversation with people whose heads were bobbing up and down and talk about any of that. So that, I think, is really we really have to think about that, because that is a danger. That is truly a danger.
Okay, something I found funny is that you, at some point toward the end of the book, you say that you're defined as in your basically MIT is a powerhouse of technology, and yet with all your arguments about the fact that technology has its side effects and we have to be careful about that, you're defined as a killjoy.
Yes, I was defined as a killjoy.
What I really liked is that at some point you also talked about the fact that in the department there were a floor for thinking and a floor for feeling, and what you wanted to do is to really put together thinking and feeling, which is exactly what we did in my lab, in which basically the level of the brain we looked at cognitive and affective empathy. Tell us more about that.
Well, I was trained, I went to graduate school at Harvard, and I studied personality psychology, and that was the feeling section of the psychology department. but the cognitive psychologists had just broken off and they were on another floor. I mean, literally, there was no physical, there was no meshing. And I remember thinking, I want to devote my career to projects where thinking and feeling are somehow brought together. Yeah. Because that's how I experienced my own thinking, that it was all about feeling. And that's what I was saying about the motivation for writing the book. I mean, it's a book about thinking, where as I'm thinking, I'm telling you how I'm feeling.
Yeah.
And the image that I had of William James Hall at the time was that, you know, you were really on different floors, and my work and my life would somehow bring these floors together. So it's been a journey. It's been a journey.
And it resonates with what we did in many years of experiments very, very well. Speaking of that, so then now I want to talk about the combination of thinking and feeling and emotion when it comes to learning. You describe at some point what's called packet switching, basically the internet works, that breaks down a message in many different parts, goes to different routers, and then it gets back together and reaches the receiver of the message. Believe it or not, we did a brain imaging study on that, in which we actually taught college students. It was a collaboration with a professor in education and one in communication studies. We teach a bunch of students the classical way in which you teach packet switching with just the dry technological language. And then another group get taught the packet switching concept in a much more embodied way, with a way more narrative. And then when they're asked to actually repeat their concept, they actually inspired and incited to use their gestures, their bodies, to actually describe this concept. Then we put them in the scanner and we ask them to think about the questions about how the internet works, how packet switching works, and so on and so forth. And we image the brain of these participants while they're doing the group that get the technological dry teaching, and the one that get a more embodied, affective sort of teaching. And lo and behold, there is much more brain activity, especially mirror neuronas, in the kids that get taught in an embodied, emotional way compared to the ones that get taught in the more technological and dry way. And the ones that got taught in the more emotional way also fared better in terms of learning the concept. And this reminds me of something that you describe in your book when your husband-to-be Seymour meets for the first time your grandfather, and he teaches him juggling. And then you say that what he was doing is to basically directly engage the emotional life of his learner. Yes. And that's, I think, that's how learning really works. You have to really combine both the passion, the feelings, yes, emotions, and the more intellectual aspect of
yes. It. I mean, it was an extraordinary moment because I was marrying, so I was introducing my husband to be to my grandfather, who, I mean, my husband to be had a beard. He was 20 years older than me. He had a little South African accent. All of these things were not going to be good for my grandfather. These were not going to be good for my grandfather. But what Seymour did was introduce himself, give my grandfather delicatessen from Zabar's, which was a fancy delicatessen in New York. So my grandfather had the foods of his, you know, kind of his comfort foods while he was meeting Seymour. It was kind of a gesture of kind of, you know, I recognize you. And then he took out little red balls and he taught my grandfather how to juggle. I mean, just the beginning of juggling. My grandfather was in his 80s. Yeah. And it wasn't just that my grandfather, you know, had the thrill of learning how to juggle, but it made my grandfather think of my grandfather hadn't been taught anything new for decades. Yeah. I mean, he had quit school at 12 to go to work and earn money for his family. Nobody had sat and tried to teach him, maybe since then. And he he began to talk about his first job as a bookbinder and about the physicality of making the books. And as he was juggling, he began to talk about the pleasure and sensuality of learning how to be a bookbinder. And I just had this kind of insight, this flash, that body involvement, as you point out, that involvement of the whole person, you know, his sense of being important, the sense that people were paying attention to him, and that he was remembering the pleasure of having that kind of relationship with a tactile thing. He loved Seymour. He loved juggling. It was a beautiful learning moment. It really was. It really was.
Hi, Vicky.
Hi, Marco and Sherry. I'm sorry to interrupt this fascinating discussion. Thank you both so much. I think everybody learned a lot from both of you today, and we have a lot of questions. So I want to get right to them. There are several questions about empathy in children and adolescents. Is it developmental or is it learned? Got two questions, one from Robin and one from Marilyn on this subject.
Marco, why don't you talk about that from the neuroscience point of view first?
Well, I mean, developmental means that innate versus learned. I don't think there is strong evidence that there is anything that is innate when it comes to empathy itself. Empathy is a fairly complex thing. So there's a lot of it has to do with nurturing. I would say that in general, the human behavior and human biology, or just biology in general, I would say it's a combination of nature and nurture. If you have some genetic endowment that makes you unable to learn certain things, it's going to be very difficult for you to learn those things. But in general, empathy is something that it's fundamentally, you basically get it out of your environment. So it's there's a lot of learning that is important in empathy, that is environmental learning. But there may be a biological component in the sense that extreme cases may actually determine an inability to learn to be empathic. And we may have also cases in psychiatry of psychopathy, predisposition to be a psychopath. They may reduce your capacity to empathize regardless of what's the condition in which you find yourself. But there are famous cases like the orphans, in the Romanian orphans, in which clearly their early life experience reduced their capacity for empathy. But the good thing is that when I went to med school, it was many years ago, we thought that after you reach like 25 years old, you start just losing brain cells and that's it. We now know that the brain can be very plastic, like Sherry's grandfather when he was learning to juggle, very plastic, very late in life. So there's always time to relearn empathic skills.
Thank you, Marco. Sherry, did you want to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to say that the first time I used the phrase, the Empathy Diaries, was in a book I wrote called Reclaiming Conversation, the book before this, where I was studying a middle school where teachers asked me to consult about their fears for their students who were so involved with their devices that they seemed to not be looking at each other and listening to each other, who seemed to somehow not care for each other the way the teachers wanted them to. And that was the first time that the phrase, the Empathy Diaries, came to me, and we began to, work with the students and talk to the teachers about that. So I think certainly you can see signs of an assault on empathy and of children not having the practice and of listening and attending to each other because of overuse of devices, certainly by adolescents and even younger.
Well, I'll just say one more thing. If you study human conversation, the turn taking between who's speaking now and who's speaking after that, it's a tenth of a second. We are so attuned to each other that we are able to predict when I can come in, when Sherry stops talking, and when I can talk. I have to say that on Zoom, that breaks down a little. And it breaks down a little because when we are face to face, we can read way more than what we're saying. We can read the facial expression, the postures, and all that information we computed to actually have a very engaging and back and forth communication.
Thank you both. We have a question from Amy. Is there a typical pattern by which fight or flight responses alter patterns of imitation and mirroring?
A typical pattern. I would say probably there isn't a typical pattern, but I would say if there is a really dramatic situation of fight or flight, that could break down that sort of imitative tendency that we have. On the other hand, I can see that imitation itself maybe generate fight or flight situation in the sense that, you know, gang behavior, it's also in a way, what I call it, the dark side of empathy, because people that belong to the same gang, they may actually be driving each other to have that sort of hostile behavior toward other people, to members outside the gang. And that it's also a form of imitation and something that needs to be controlled. And that's why it's important to have also cognitive empathy, not just the emotional one.
Thank you. We have several questions about psychiatric disorders, such as autism and borderline personality disorder. How did the people with these disorders, especially young people, how do they distinguish imitation from empathy? And how do they, I'm trying to rephrase because there's so many, how do they distinguish imitation and empathy?
Well, one thing we know is that some of these conditions, I have some sort of imitative deficits. And a lot of them have actually empathy deficits. And some of the, if you look at the level of empathy in people with these sort of disorders, you find that indeed it can be even predictor of things like hospitalization or visits to emergency rooms. So that really shows that it's, and we think about empathy as really connecting between people, but it's more than that. If I'm not able to empathize with others, my social life is horrible. And if my social life is horrible, then my mental condition deteriorates. We are really good in psychiatry now to treat certain dramatic symptoms in psychiatric patients. I'll give you an example, schizophrenia. We have a bunch of meds that we can use to treat schizophrenic patients that are hallucinating. They will stop hallucinating. But we know, and Michael Green, which is a colleague here at UCLA, has studied this, their social cognition is still impaired, even though they don't hallucinate anymore. And their community functioning is extremely reduced because of that. So empathy is such a pervasive function in our social life that if it is somewhat disordered, somewhat not efficient as it should be, which comes naturally to all of us, then your mental life suffers and then you become a patient with mental health issues.
I wanted to say one other thing about Zoom, which is that I'm very committed to looking at Marco's face. And so I've been looking at his face during this conversation. But I know that in order to give Marco the best, and my audience, the best sense that I'm making eye contact with you, I should be looking at the camera.
That's
but
right.
If I look at the camera the way I am now, so that you feel as though I'm looking at you in your eyes, I'm looking at nothing.
I know, that's the weird thing about
this. This is truly I think this is kind of ground zero of any conversation about digital conversation, and Zoom is great and da da da. Zoom is great, but I'm looking at nothing now in order to give you the feeling that I'm looking at you. And now I'm looking at you and I can pick up all those clues and little expressions, but to you, I looks like I'm looking off to the side. And this really perturbs. And, you get used to it. I guess you get used to it. We've done it all during the pandemic. We're all used to it. But this deeply perturbs our sense of what it is to look at someone in the eye and pick up all of those things that we're looking for. And I think it's so important that even as we celebrate, thank God we had Zoom during the pandemic. Thank God we had this technology. I'm no Luddite about this. We not go overboard, and we respect that that it is not the same. It is not the same.
Not the same.
Because of this quality, because of this thing. And I just want to say that, I'm trained as a psychotherapist, and there are so many psychotherapists who are now saying, I'm just going to do my psychotherapy, online. It's so much more convenient. I can have patients all over the country. Hey, careful, attention, as they say in French. Careful. There's a lot that's being missed, and you need to respect that. And that's part of my message.
I want to say one thing about masking, though. There's something interesting about masking, because it covers most of the face but keeps the eyes open. I think that it invites more to eye connection, which is so powerful in human communication.
That's interesting.
Quite interesting, yeah.
Thank you both. I think, Sherry, you really described well what we need is the human connection, which is much more difficult to get through a screen than in person. We have time for one more question from Lily for Dr. Iacoboni. Are you suggesting that imitation is the same as empathy?
No, it's not the same as empathy. Imitation is one way to get into the minds of others. So one of the ideas is that by sort of imitating your body postures, your facial expressions, I get more what is going on into your mind. It's a way of getting into the minds of others, but it's not exactly the same thing. And of course, it all depends. It's very fragile in the sense that you have to do it in a way that is natural. If you do it in a way that is too intentional, then it breaks down. That's the beauty of human interaction. They have to be fluid, fluent, natural. If I'm trying to intentionally imitate Sherry's blinking, every time she blinks, probably I'm going to disrupt all the patterns of empathic connection that we have with each other. So it's a fine line, but it's a way, and there's beautiful passages from many thinkers and writers that really suggested a way to get into the minds of others using an embodied way.
Thank you. I am so sorry that we have to end this discussion, which has been so fascinating. Thank you both for taking the time to be here with us today and to educate us. We are very, very grateful to you both, and we're very grateful to everybody that has tuned in today. We hope to see you soon. Our next Open Mind program is on December 8th with Dr. Bezel Vanderkolk, whose book has been on the New York Times bestseller list for over 121 weeks. It is titled The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. So look forward to seeing everybody. Thank you. Stay well, stay safe, and thank you for joining us. Good night.
Thank you.
You.